Hey everyone, and welcome back to Pragmatic EDH. Today we will be discussing mulligans, and before we begin, I'd like to apologize for the break kind of thing that happened. It was really more I was busy with life, and I'm currently also looking for a new job. So, anyway, now to jump into it. In Magic and Commander, mulligans are also known as basically hand do-overs, and what a mulligan does essentially is you take the cards in your hand, you put them into your deck, like you shuffle them, and then you draw a fresh 7, 6, 5, 4, etc., etc., based on how many times you've mulliganed prior. This is, I believe, called the London Mulligan, and it's kind of been the longest lived mulligan that I've been aware of. But for the most part, it's generally a pretty good system. Now, in Commander, a mulligan will say if you go down to a specific hand size, you would draw to 7 and then put that many cards from your hand to the bottom of your library. And that's really what defines what a mulligan is. Defining when a mulligan is necessary is something that's been incredibly tricky, but I think I've narrowed it down to something reasonably simple. And it comes down to whether or not, with your commander, can you either cast your commander to make up for the value you're choosing to lose by keeping the hand, or can you advance your game plan in order to get to your commander or to your game plan with just the cards in your hand by themselves? And the reason this distinction is important is because this is Commander, and because we're talking about EDH in general, your Commander will dictate a lot of how your keeps and plays and other sort of things you're going to be doing are going to be done. Specifically in the way that your Commander will, and I'll harp on this a lot, dictate how your deck functions, or at least spearhead its play style, if nothing else. Say, for example, you've got a very simple commander that doesn't really have any abilities. That's not really going to change how your deck's going to play, but if your commander can draw cards, if your commander can interact with your opponents, if your commander creates value for you, you're probably running cards that support that. And if your game plan is to support your commander's abilities or what they do or their game plan, you're eventually going to want to have cards that you can either cast with the mana you're able to generate or have the ability to get to the cards that allow you to cast those cards or find those cards as long as you have the mana. Learning when to mulligan is very useful to a player in a game of Magic, and it's something that's very tough to describe to someone who's inexperienced because the need for you to mulligan is something that becomes sort of intuitive as you get more experience in Commander and in Magic in general. There are a few specific factors that are very easy tells on whether or not something should be thrown away as a hand, like you should mulligan it or not. And those things are if you don't have any mana. So, like, if you don't have any lands, if you don't have any mana rocks or artifacts that can create mana, or you don't have any ramp spells or spells that get lands, basically, if you don't have anything that can advance your average land for turn or your mana production can't be helped at all by what's in your hand, chances are it's probably not good to keep. Another good example of something like that is when you have nothing to do with your mana. So if you've got a hand that's full of lands, but your commander doesn't either draw you cards or your commander doesn't advance your game plan in general, it's probably not a good hand to keep, and it's usually going to cost you in the long run. So it's a little bit more inadvisable to keep something that, while it has plenty of mana access, may actually restrict your ability to do anything beyond your commander itself, unless that is your game plan. Which, in that case, whatever, right? But the biggest mistake I see people do is they get excited about individual cards, or they get excited about specific things they've seen happen or cards that have been used against them that have been incredibly effective in a different deck, and they'll keep cards off of it. A great example of this is people who keep Soul Ring hands, but they really only keep a Soul Ring hand because they've got like one land and they've got like, a couple 4 or 5 drops in their hand, and it's not really realistic or sustainable to do that. Granted, in that exact instance, that would be fine because we're going to talk about the statistical probability of drawing specific types of cards, particularly lands, and how that's going to affect your mulligan outcomes. But in reality, that's definitely one I wouldn't recommend keeping if you're mana value is high and your mana production is low, but you have a way to create mana quickly, doesn't necessarily mean your deck is going to function. Now, an example of things that are good to know about, particularly when it comes to mulliganing, in the sense that we're talking about when it's necessary to mulligan, are talking about like what kind of weird niche cases, I call them niche, but they're more common than you might think, where someone is running a hand that may not have enough mana to produce what they're looking for, but they do have enough mana to get cards to find more cards. And that's something that's very important in particularly Commander's card draw. Granted, it's not any less important in any other formats, it's just in Commander because it's a 99 card deck. You have a way higher likelihood of not seeing a specific card, so it's better to see as many as possible. And to that matter, an example would be if you're keeping a hand that's got a card draw effect for 2 mana, and you've only got 2 mana that you can produce, it's probably an alright hand to keep as long as the rest of your deck isn't like, really expensive. And that's really what this boils down to, I suppose, is that the average mana cost of your deck will dictate what kind of mulligans you're willing or should be willing to keep. And an example of that would be a deck that plays on average 4 mana cards can probably keep a 3 land hand because it's not unlikely that you're going to draw a card by the time you get to your fourth draw. Based on that as well, a deck that tries to play an average 6 CMC deck should not keep a 3 land hand. That would be unrealistic and unreasonable. It would be argued that also playing that deck would be bad, but you know what? I'm not here to cast stones. Anyway, back to it. We're talking about how if you are to play a specific hand, you should have the ability to cast a specific percentage or amount of your deck based on what you're willing to do. And if you can only cast a small percentage of your deck, all those cards should be relatively functional, either finding you more cards that are relevant to your play, things that advance your board state, or things that interact with your opponents. An example of this would be removal, ramp, artifacts, counterspells, or draw effects. Based on some observations I've made over the past couple months, and along with some of the shifts in Commander's tone towards being a little bit more powerful but a little bit more friendly, it's very hard to describe, but that's been my personal experience, is that it has really presented a strange dichotomy between people who play very casual, low level, unfocused power decks to people who play high power. In terms of how they mulligan, that's a really easy way to discern whether or not someone's newer or not to higher power like games or formatting. And the reason that is, I believe, has to do with the optimization of opening hands. So if you're playing a very powerful deck, you're looking for very few specific cards that are going to allow you to explode out of the gate, or it's going to allow you to stop your opponents from exploding out of the gate. And on average, I've tended to see people go down to like 5 or 6, and it's usually they'll be able to keep their second 7 if they're mulliganing at all, which tends to happen more frequently just to look for specific cards. But very often, more than that, I will see people go down to 6, and even sometimes even lower than that. And when I played CDH, I've certainly seen an average game where the average hand size in the opener was like 4 or 5, and we still had to deal with like maybe 12 threats by turn 3. It was kind of ridiculous. It just ended up being a very eye-opening experience because as someone who played a lot of casual prior to moving to high power a couple years ago, it was really interesting to see that like you can't just keep your opening 7 if it seems playable, if it just seems good enough. The reason I bring this all back to the when and why you should really mulligan, or why a mulligan may be necessary, comes down to people who tend to struggle in games, not necessarily saying they're bad or good or they have weak decks or strong decks, tend to be people who don't mulligan really at all. They'll just kind of see an opening hand and try and make the best of it rather than just kind of throwing in the towel, being like, all right, well, I could clearly do better and I probably should at least try. And when you hear someone who talks about risky keeps all the time, I may be included on the list. I mean, well, they really are kind of throwing caution to the wind with their deck. They're really not trying to achieve their goal, or maybe they are, they're just going about it the wrong way. And trying to mulligan yourself out of a good situation is what you're doing is really not helpful to you as a player. And it can actually really drag down games too, because it doesn't matter how strong of a deck someone has if they keep just awful hands. And the reason why this is such a negative thing and why I'm really bringing it up is it tends to make the people who are playing it either feel bad or they tend to salt the table. So encourage mulliganing, even if it's not necessarily going to help you, because it'll help the mentality of the table stay on track. And as we've talked about in some of the past videos, is keeping a good mentality when you're playing a game will actually just make games more fun, even if you lose. So just make sure that everyone is keeping realistically good hands, and like especially so if you're trying to teach someone how to play, is really harp on the importance of keeping good things so you can have good things to do. In this upcoming section, I will be discussing things I consider to be more advanced. And it doesn't mean that it's not accessible to everybody, of course, because I think it's necessary to teach everyone in any sort of layman's terms. I know I tend to use a little bit of lingo, and I'm still trying to correct myself, so I apologize to anybody that may be new that's watching and doesn't get it. But I would say this is supposed to be a little bit more advanced for people who are looking to maybe go from a higher power level or from casual to higher power. That's not to say that these discussion points can't be useful to a player who's just trying to up their win rate in whatever play level they're at, and that's completely fine. It's just meant to be something that when I was discussing it with some of my friends across different power levels, the ones in high power said, "Oh, that's a really interesting observation," and the ones at low power looked at me like I had three heads. So this kind of stuff would be more along the lines of more specific and complex strategy. Not that newer players wouldn't get it, not that I'm saying anybody wouldn't understand it because they play XYZ. It just tends to be something that's a little bit more akin to higher power or CDH, where this is something you have to consider a lot more carefully. That all being said, the topics I'm going to be talking about are using averages based on given knowledge to dictate whether or not a hand is capable in comparison to the type of cards you have in your list, the count of types of cards you have in your list, the land counts in your list, and several other factors. I'll be talking about creating success scenarios based on specific factors like board state, hand size, commander checking, and then also finally we'll be talking about how commanders that your opponents have will dictate whether or not a mulligan for you is necessary and the information that a commander can give. For our first sort of hypothetical and moving forward, we will be using a few given factors for a deck. Firstly, we're going to be assuming we're going to be using, as of currently and filming of the video, the rank 13th most popular commander of the past 2 years, according to EDHREC, which is Ishin, Two Heavens is one. Ishin is a 3-drop in red, white, black, or Mardu. And he or they say that if a creature attacking causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. This creature is also a human samurai and is a 3/4. So taking all these all these figures into account, what's really going to matter here is we're also moving on the assumption that this deck is going to have about 30-ish synergy pieces, and the rest are going to be filled with ramp and card draw and removal, because we're going to assume no counter spells, or very few, if any, in the deck, because you are playing without blue. A commander like this one will really want to have a lot of setup. So having lots of things that either slow your opponents down or speed you up are going to be highly desirable in your opener. So cards that generate lots of mana, cards that create value for you for just doing what you're already doing, or cards that set up prior to your commander coming out are really things you're going to want to run and things that you're going to want to try and keep in your opening hands, because they really will push you forward and then in front of your opponents. The reason particularly that mulligans like this are something to consider is because your commander and the cards that it demands you put into your deck are ones that will innately be strong and push you farther ahead of your opponents again, really because of the way that the card itself is designed to function and operate in the space it tries to create in order to be successful. Means that you won't necessarily need as many payoff cards as you will cards that just do multiple things. So a card that can, when it attacks, remove stuff will be even better if you can remove two things once your commander comes out. Or an example of a card that, when it attacks, it maybe creates an additional combat and making everything else trigger again would be a great example of cards that you would probably run that are going to be very good. And honestly, it's just going to be overall beneficial for you to just run them in general. And so you're going to run those cards already. They're going to be kind of your baseline, the reason you probably built the deck in the first place. And the unfun cards are going to be the ones that allow you to be able to reach those strategies and win using what drew you to the commander in the first place. Looking objectively at these sort of commanders in the same light of value versus output and differentiating between what kind of things your commanders are trying to do can really help you dictate exactly what sort of cards you're going to want to keep versus what sort of cards are really going to enable your strategy. And the reason those are different is because cards you want to keep are not necessarily cards that you should keep. And that should stand to reason fairly well with cards that when I described unfun earlier, they're cards that are just kind of uninteresting, or they're necessary evils or necessary adds you need to just be able to run a functional deck and still interact with your opponents in any sort of meaningful way. In this next example, we will be discussing the highs and lows of using, again, the same commander, what kind of hand you would want to keep in general. And what that really boils down to is keeping a hand that will have plenty of interaction based on the knowledge you have of your opponents. An example of this would be if you're seeing a deck that's very clearly an artifact strategy, having ways to interact with those types of permanents will be extremely useful to you. Having ways to generate card advantage if you really don't know what's going on or you really don't have a way to gauge your opponents, just so you can generate value of your own and then force your opponents to respond to you, is also very good. And lastly, you can never go wrong with a payoff of some variety that you can just keep maybe one of and then have a few other randomly assorted cards that provide you with enough ways to do things about your opponents or things that they do and do things to their strategy to slow them down. So an example of this would be something that would maybe prevent your opponents from being able to cast their commanders, like Draenith Magistrate, for example. Or another example would be running a card that allows you to reanimate a creature that you know is probably going to get removed in as fast a way as possible because it comes out early. Running ways to stop that creature from dying or being able to bring them back is going to be equally beneficial. Basically, it's allowing you to create a scenario where, with the cards you're given and the information you have innately, you can make a winning strategy, or at least have a game plan, at least for the next turn or two, as you make things happen, because of course the game state will change based on the more information you get. So to get to the example, in this opener, we have 3 creatures that enable attack triggers, and we have 3 lands, and we have 1 piece of interaction. Now, I think this is actually something that, depending on what the attack triggers are, you might be able to keep it, but in most instances, it's not really worth keeping. So, the reason I would say this is because most creatures, based on my own knowledge of the game, with that do attacking, tend to cost about 3 or more. 3 or more mana to really get going. That means you're not probably going to really be doing anything in the first couple turns of setup, and so you're not really going to be helping yourself advance in front of your opponents, which is based on what your commander is saying. Again, we're talking about Ishin. You want to get ahead of your opponents by generating either a lead ahead of them or slowing them down and pulling farther ahead of them than they could pull ahead of you. And having a slower kind of, I'd almost call it a tempo or something where you're playing cards per turn at a specific cost is not going to be beneficial to you if your tempo starts as late as 3 mana. So, keeping a hand with lots of good, interesting attacky creatures at an average mana cost of, 2 or 3 with a 3-land hand, unless you're directly able to interact with your opponents through attacking, really is a bad keep. You're going to actively regret keeping that hand because you can never assume that a card that needs to attack will stick around if it interacts with your opponent's strategy, because chances are they kept maybe a 1 or 2 off removal thing just in case you're able to interact with their strategies. So being cognizant of your potential interactions and things that you could be interacted with is something you're going to really want to care about in the early first couple of turns, because they will dictate the pace of your game. In this final scenario, we will be discussing exactly what a good hand is going to be. And so an example of a really good hand would be maybe a mana rock that filters colors for you at 2 drops, let's say like a Boros Signet. A really solid attacking creature, let's say something like you've got a Captain Lannery Storm, and you're able to run her out, and she provides instantaneous value, and it doesn't necessarily mean you need your commander out in order for her to be successful, but having enough colors to get to her is going to be important, so we're going to assume maybe a 3-ish land hand, maybe 2 or 3, and then maybe 1 or 2 pieces of interaction, like let's say you have a Swords to Plowshares and a Disenchant. And then you'll have one other attacking creature, let's say an Atali, right? So you've got something to do later on once you've generated all your mana. And that would be what I would describe as maybe a fairly optimal hand for Ishin. However, having just one of those cards missing would make the hand significantly worse. So let's say you just had, just another general attacking creature. Let's say Krenko, the 10th Street Kingpin. It would be good to have that in your hand, but you can't rely solely on its power, and you can't rely solely on the mana it's going to generate for you. So being smart about exactly what the card can do for you to advance your strategy is going to be something you're really going to want to pay attention to when keeping specific cards or keeping specific hands for specific cards. This next scenario we will be talking about here, which we are now starting, is called success scenarios, or creating them. And success scenarios are essentially creating lines to your win condition, or lines to win the game, or even lines to just completely pull ahead of your opponents so they can't reasonably catch up to you, barring, maybe really specific removal. An example of this is saying, oh, I've got a few cards in my hand that can go infinite with like a Kiki Jiki, or I've got a couple cards that will generate so many tokens after a set amount of turns that if I have a card that's a payoff for creature tokens, the game's just going to end, or something along those lines, right? So if you are finding yourself with a hand where you've got half of a piece, the rest of your goal with this success scenario should be to achieving the other half of that piece, barring that piece is still with you by the time you can achieve it. So having an unreachable goal, let's say you've got a handful of really decent half of a combo card pieces, but you've got no way to advance your board state and you've got no way to draw cards, means that your success scenario is unviable, and therefore you should probably consider a mulligan. But if you've got a hand where, let's say you've got Krenko 10th Street Kingpin and a Demonic Tutor, and you can say, well, if Krenko starts to set up and starts being ridiculous, I can go tutor for my Perforos a little later on once I've got Ishin out, and I can really probably one-shot the table in 1 or 2 rotations, or at least put them in some serious threat of dying, and that's going to make a huge difference in whether or not you're going to be able to keep a hand. So learning ways that you can see to lines of victory and noticing which cards go together with which other cards in order for you to fully attain your goal of either winning or creating a specific board state, whether or not it's viable to achieve that kind of thing with what you've got in your hand, or if it's something that just is really going to not do anything and you should probably mulligan. Rolling right along into our final topic or checkpoint of the video is going to be using information given or game state in order to decide whether or not a mulligan is something that is necessary. And the reason that this is last in the order is this is basically a cumulative check of the last 2 major kind of advanced technical uses of information to decide mulligans, is applying that information, the information you have of, checking your averages and then creating success scenarios versus using what you know about your opponents. So a commander can tell a lot about what an opponent is going to be playing, and an example of that might be if you see a deck that's playing Talrand or Baral as their commander, chances are they're going to be running lots of instants and sorceries or a lot of non-creature spells because they have payoff for that. It's very unlikely you're going to see a Talrand deck that will not make a single Drake when its commander's in play, because that would make Talrand itself be kind of useless. And so looking at a table and saying, oh, well, I know this commander. I know some roughly of the cards that are going to draw people to it, and I know roughly some of the high synergy pieces. You can make pretty realistic assumptions about some cards that are going to be in a deck and what kind of cards they're going to be, and how necessarily you would personally apply your own version of what you'd keep in a deck where those cards were in it with their colors, and applying that to the game, saying that, oh, well, I'm going to assume that this deck that runs lots of either instants and sorceries is probably going to have at least one or two counterspells in their hand, and is me having a very vulnerable strategy to just a single counterspell worth keeping my hand for? So we talked about that Krenko hand earlier, where you would want Krenko and then a Demonic Tutor. Well, if they don't counter Krenko, but they do counter Demonic Tutor, you can still reasonably achieve a victory because your board state will get large. But if they counter Krenko and they counter Demonic Tutor, that's really rough. That's a tough spot to be in because you'll have nothing to really resolve after that. So being aware of exactly what your weak points are and making sure you plan ahead for them with what the hand you keep is going to be extremely important in the art of mulliganing. And with that, I think I'm going to leave y'all. Thank you so much for listening and to me prattle on about a subject I'm very passionate about, which is mulligans. I will see you in the next one. Take it easy. Goodbye.